Welcome to another edition of Radio Influencers, a podcast series we're doing for Radio Update. I'm your host, Andy Meadows. If you watch or read my content, you're well aware that I'm a big believer in radio people doing audio-video podcasts. I've been saying for years, every on-air personality should be doing this. I even wrote an ebook about how easy it is for on-air talent to adapt their radio broadcasting skills so they work well podcasting. It's called From Broadcast to Podcast, Applying Radio Rules to Podcasting. Recently, I also wrote about why CEOs and GMs should podcast as well, because it's a great way to lead by example. If the person in charge is doing it, then how can on-air personalities continue to resist podcasting? And because it's a great way to establish themselves as thought leaders within the community. Part of the reason I always encourage adding the element of video is it massively improves the reach and effectiveness of a podcast. That's because it makes it easy to pull and share video reels to use on social media, gives you long-form video to share on the station website and YouTube, currently the leading site for consuming podcasts of any kind. And there are ways to tie advertisers into all of that, which is made easier by adding the element of video. Even from day one, before you have any downloads, you can tie in advertisers, something I'll expand on with my final thought at the end of this. So since this is a recurring topic of mine, I've had a lot of conversations with those in and outside of our industry about why radio is so resistant to podcasting. From those conversations, my conclusion is that part of it is the feeling that it's beneath us because there's no barrier for entry. Literally anyone can start a podcast. There are currently somewhere between 3.5 to 6 million podcasts, depending on the source and how you categorize them. There are only 44,000 radio stations worldwide, 15,445 of which are here in the United States. So podcasting is a much less exclusive club than radio, which we all know is a smaller, more tight-knit community than most people on the outside realize. But another big part of the reason radio people don't commit to podcasting is the time and the cost. They're already stretched thin, wearing multiple hats, doing the work whole staffs used to do, like we discussed on last week's More with Less episode. And we're all trying to watch every single dollar, especially right now based on our economy and how our industry is trending overall. I fully understand why radio people would ask themselves, is it really worth my time and money to enter into a very crowded market and become podcast number 6,000,001? So to help anyone wrestling with that question right now, I thought we'd talk about exactly what it costs, both financially and time-wise, to start a podcast. After watching or listening, if you have any questions, email me at andy@radiostationconsultant.com or editor@radioupdate.com, and I'll answer them to the best of my ability. The cost. One of the main reasons there are so many people podcasting is it's relatively cheap to do so. Even running lean in the smallest markets, a single station costs thousands of dollars a month to operate before you hire a single employee. You can start a podcast with a $50 USB mic, the webcam already built into your laptop, and a $20 a month subscription to a podcast hosting site that gets your podcast on all the major platforms. Which you want to do, by the way. Podcasts should absolutely be on the station website, of course, but that shouldn't be the only place they are. You have to fish where the fish are by putting your podcast on all the sites people already go to get their podcast: Apple, Spotify, Podchaser, Deezer, etc. And luckily, it's pretty inexpensive to do so. I wrote an article recently you could find on Radio Update listing the 5 best podcast hosting sites for broadcasters: Simplecast, Buzzsprout, Transistor, Podcast Plus, and Podbean. They are all in that $10 to $20 per month range, and most have free trials and come along with some monetization and promotional tools. I mentioned a $50 USB mic before. Here's one from Audio-Technica in that price range. However, if you're going with a USB mic, I would strongly suggest spending $199 for the Rode PodMic USB or $259 to $279 for the Shure MV7, this one, or the MV7 Plus, their new one, because these sound closer to the professional broadcast mics we're used to and our listeners are used to hearing us on. I would also suggest spending at least $100 on a good quality 4K webcam. The one I use is the Osbot Meet 4K, and it's $120, even cheaper when it's on sale. Then another $50 to $100 on supplemental lighting that will vary based on your room. So all in all, one-time upfront hard cost for podcast equipment, if you're going to do a solo podcast where any guest would be recorded remotely, is anywhere from $50 to $400, depending on how professional you want it to look and sound. In addition to the podcast hosting site, I would recommend paying $30 per month to get a Riverside FM subscription. This is basically Zoom for broadcasters. It's what I'm recording this on right now. It allows you to record high-quality audio and video remotely over the internet, which does require a little more bandwidth. You'll need a minimum of 5 megabits per second upload and 10 megabits per second download. However, the beauty of it is it saves a local copy, so if you ever have a guest with a bandwidth issue, which you absolutely will, the final product won't be affected. It also has a bunch of awesome AI tools that save you a bunch of time editing. So the monthly recurring costs are a total of $50 per month between the podcast hosting site and Riverside for recording. Additional costs. Obviously, if you want to do an in-person podcast, you'll need additional mics. If you don't want to use multiple USB mics or already have broadcast XLR mics you want to use, you could jump to a Rodecaster Pro 2, now $689 as of this recording. Or Zoom now has a competing PodTrack P8 that's only $299. Still sounds good and has a battery-powered option you might want to check out. Plus, you'll want to jump to multicam, which can get pricey quick. But there are a lot of options in the $1,000 to $2,000 range that I've talked about in the past in our My Home Studio episode, but I can fully break down in a future episode. Paying guests. To be clear, the majority of podcasts do not pay their guests. At most, maybe they reimburse them for gas. However, some podcasts, especially as they're getting established, do pay guests. Bobby Altoff famously went from no subscribers to millions in a very short time by offering to pay famous rappers $300 to come on her podcast, The Really Good Podcast, when she started. Because she had a unique angle that people connected with, she only had to do that for a short while, but it worked because it added legitimacy and got her a Drake interview pretty quickly, which of course then went viral and got her on the map. The reason people pay guests is simple. In the beginning, you want to pay people who have a larger following than you to come on your podcast, so their existing fan base sees it when they either share it or you tag them. Luckily, in radio, we already have access to some celebrities through our stations, so that should give us a leg up. But that doesn't mean I'd rule out occasionally paying guests in the beginning if you want to ramp up quickly. Paying guests also helps alleviate one of the big pain points of podcasting, guest cancellations, which will absolutely happen. That's why most weekly podcasts work a few weeks in advance or are willing to do solo episodes like I do, not just because of guest cancellations, by the way. I think it's a good way to hyper-focus on some important subjects too, like we are today. But people are much less likely to cancel if they're getting paid, even if it's a small amount. It's human nature. They'll feel guiltier. Regardless, cancellations will happen because people get sick, emergencies come up, yada, yada, yada. The big secret for getting guests is to follow the lead of other podcasters and offer to do other people's podcasts as a guest, which, by the way, is a great marketing tool anyway. Speaking of marketing, it's also a good idea to set aside a marketing budget. Obviously, you'll be promoting the podcast on your stations, but you'll also want to boost some of the clips on social so you can target specific interests, locations, and demographics. Just $25 to $50 on the right platform and the right clip can get you between 10,000 to 20,000 impressions, so it's a great hack when you're trying to ramp up quickly. And even once a podcast is established, it's still a good idea to occasionally boost some of the clips that are already getting a lot of traction organically to add fuel to the fire. Time commitment. The time it takes to produce a podcast also varies wildly depending on the type of podcast you're doing, how elaborate you want the production to be, and how experienced the person doing the editing. So I'll just speak to my personal experience. I always tell on-air talent on music stations to spend 30 minutes preparing for every hour they are on the air, so a 4-hour show needs 2 hours of show prep to be competitive on the radio, in my professional opinion. Because podcasting is more like talk radio than music radio, it takes a minimum of an hour of preparation for every hour you're recording, if not a little more while you're developing your podcasting process. Obviously, if you have a guest, you want to research them, write more questions than you think you're going to need, by the way, because some of the guests will give you long, elaborate answers, and others will give you short and to-the-point answers. If you don't have a guest, you want to spend that same amount of time putting your own thoughts together and either preparing bullet points or a full script to keep you on track. I wouldn't wing solo episodes unless you're Bill Burr. It's unlikely to work. Editing without the help of AI generally takes about 2 hours for every hour you've recorded, especially if it's multiple guests and multiple cameras. However, that process has been cut down substantially now with the help of AI tools, like the ones built into Riverside and a whole host of other AI editing platforms like Opus Clip, Spike Studio, Video.ai, and many, many others that are popping up daily, plus some of the AI tools being built directly into video editors now. We use Adobe Premiere and After Effects, by the way, but a good free-to-start video editor is HitFilm. I haven't used it in a while, so I'm not sure what AI tools come along with it, but there probably are some at this point. AI also makes it easier for people who haven't learned how to video edit well yet to produce professional-looking podcasts without hiring a video editor, which can be, of course, expensive. On average now, I spend about 30 to 45 minutes total editing any podcast, no matter how elaborate it is. So between prep, recording time, and editing, I'm usually spending 2.5 hours total per podcast episode, but that was a lot more before I started using AI to help in the process. 2 other quick things I'll say on cost. I would suggest growing as you go and starting with whatever you got. The iPhone has a great built-in 4K camera. If you got one of the newer iPhones, a lot of other smartphones have 4K cameras built in. That could be your camera. You could plug a USB mic directly into that, or you could use existing mics you have and whatever kind of mixer that can feed your computer you're recording on. So start with whatever you got in the beginning and build as you go if you're trying to save money. And the second thing on cost that I'll add is if you can afford it, I would definitely suggest going to podcast conventions, especially when one's in the area close to you, because they are a little more expensive than radio conventions. There's a higher demand for them right now, so there's the entry fees are a little more, and they can be a little more expensive to go to overall. But I still would suggest going to them because that's great networking, great way to find other people with podcasts that you can go on and that you can invite on as guests and to talk about how to get advertisers and a whole host of other things. So I would definitely suggest going to some podcast conventions if you're serious about this. Final thought: podcast advertising. Even though I've just laid out how inexpensive starting a podcast can be and how it's less of a time commitment now with the use of AI, the other major hurdle most people have on committing their time and money to podcasting is the return on that investment. Podcasting ad revenue is projected to see continued growth this year. The Interactive Advertising Bureau estimates podcasting ad revenue will see a 7.4% increase again this year, which could absolutely help fill the void left by the 9.3% decrease in U.S. broadcast ad revenue Kagan forecasts for this year, provided radio gets a larger share of that podcast revenue. But that's the big question. In this incredibly saturated market made of literally millions of podcasts, can radio break through the noise and get a larger share of the $4.6 billion podcasting ad revenue is projected to bring in this year? I believe it absolutely can if we're willing to commit on a much larger scale than we are now, getting everyone in our building that has an aptitude for podcasting or an interest in learning to podcast, add the element of video to all our podcasts, and devote the time and money to professionally produce and promote them. I also believe that because radio has a built-in way to not only jumpstart podcast listenership, but also to jumpstart podcast revenue. If we take those same 45-second best of video reels we're pulling for social media and run the audio for them on air with a 15-second solicitation to sponsor, which of course turns into a sponsor mention once it's sold, not only will that specific audio clip drive significantly more traffic to the podcast episodes than a generic one, it will also drive significantly more advertiser interest as well. We all know that selling popular on-air features has always been a little easier than just selling ads. And once those on-air features are sold, the advertisers tend to hold on to them because it's a great way of doing branded advertising without breaking the bank. But what do you think? What experience has your station or group had with creating and monetizing podcasts? Email me at andy@radiostationconsultant.com or editor@radioupdate.com and let me know. As always, if you have some thoughts you'd like to share on this or any other hot radio topic, submit an article about it by emailing submissions@radioupdate.com. If we use it on the site, we will pay you for it. Thanks for listening, watching, and reading. We'll be back next week with a new episode of Radio Influencers. Radio Influencers is a Radio Update production. New episodes are released on Tuesdays at 10 a.m. Eastern.